Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Darien Library. Jay Greenfield is our author this evening. He will be presenting his debut novel, Max's Diamonds. We are thrilled to co-sponsor this event with the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. Elisa Kaplan is the president of the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. They have a following that is very fun for everyone. Thank you so much.
A very special thank you to Kim Kuchnis, and if you can spell that, I have a reward for you. And to Pat and Jane and everyone here at Darien Library. We are so thrilled to be here, and I'm actually standing in front of the guy I'm going to introduce, but I'll get out of your way in a second. The Jewish Historical Society wants to be one of the first to wish you a Shana Tova U'Mituka, a happy and healthy and sweet new year. And we've been doing that since we arrived in 1654. Moses Levy was one of the people in New Amsterdam. And after he lived there for a while, he had some business in Stamford, Connecticut. And he is supposedly the first Jew of record here in Fairfield County. And he actually went to Stanford to buy a slave. Okay, so that was then, and this is now. So we all say to you a good Yontif and Happy New Year 5777, and we've been saying that since 1654 here in the United States. Let's see who's here tonight, because you're going to want to know where these people are actually from. Okay, how many people are here from what I like to call the Golden Triangle? Are you from Darien? Look at that. And Greenwich? Hey. How about New Canaan? Beautiful. Okay. Then we probably have people here from what I like to call the Silver Triangle. Who's here from Stanford? Okay, or how about Norwalk? Yay! And how about Bridgeport? Oh, okay. Not tonight, but they do come to things. And then we also have a group of cities in Fairfield that I like to call the Platinum Triangle. If you're here from Westport, yay! Okay, you're Weston, Fairfield. Oh, okay, but we do have Westport. Well, welcome from all over the county. See, Jay Greenfield, what a draw you are? Okay. So a little commercial. The Jewish Historical Society is the largest secular Jewish organization in the area. And our goal is to create a warm and welcoming community. And along with the Darien Library, you can see that we all love to eat. So we do collect, manage, store, and showcase historical artifacts. Now, if you're going through your house and find some historical artifact or stuff that you don't want to throw away, and your children have said, no, Dad, no, Mom, we're not taking that, those immigration records, those legal documents, those pictures, we would love to have them in our archives. So consider us if you do have some historical things that you want preserved from your family for the future. And we sponsor all kinds of educational activities like tonight. And everyone should have gotten a blue card with our book talks. If you can't come to our book talks, we'll consider this your mandatory reading list for next summer. Okay, and we have some programs scheduled, monthly programs like this, and you have an ad for our next program in your hand. So we also have a marvelous Jewish public library at the J, and we do cooperate with the public libraries for lending and loaning and learning about how we can care for books ourselves. So that is us. Today is September 14th, and it is a very special day in history. For one thing, we had this tremendous storm in some places in the county just a few minutes ago. But on this day in 1741, George Friedrich Handel finished the Messiah. Are we ready? 1, 2, 3. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Yeah, we all know it. Okay. And in 1812 is another musical piece. Napoleon occupies Moscow. Oh boy. And in 1834, Charles Darwin's company passes Tagua Tagua, More, Chile. I have not been there, but okay. In 1901, speaking of politics, Theodore Roosevelt was sworn in as president. Now, why was he sworn in?
McKinley was assassinated.
Right, 100% over there. 25 points, that's right. And so, but here in Fairfield County, it was a very special day for us because in 1939, the first practical helicopter, the VS-300, which was designed by our friend and benefactor, Igor Sikorsky, took flight in Stratford, Connecticut. So it's a Sikorsky moment. All right. And for those of you who are getting ready for the World Series, in 1954, Willie Mays got his 82nd extra base hit. Don't know if that's going to happen with the Mets, but we'll see. And in 1985, which all of you are too young for, Golden Girls went on the air. Okay, but the most special, so a little history, a little commercial, but the most special thing about this evening is that we get to hear a very special man, Jay Greenfield. And Jay Greenfield is connected to Fairfield County through his wife. There you are, sitting next to your friend, cousin? Are you related to? Friend. Okay, but your cousin is here tonight, and I'd ask David and Lorraine Queskin to please stand. Let's give them a hand. Yay, there was, I know it's David, but, oh, okay, I actually don't know, I don't know that part of the family. Sorry, but I'll introduce myself afterwards. Okay, so it's all in the family tonight, Jay Greenfield. Okay, so who is this guy? And where did he, well, he's a writer. He wrote this novel, but he's also written short stories and lots of legal stuff. He's a veteran. Thank you. Thank you for your service in your time in Korea. He's a student, graduate of Cornell Law School, and Harvard, Cornell and Harvard Law School. Is that right? Okay. So he chose really easy schools to go to. He's a litigator and worked with the firm Paul, Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. And is that right? Yes. Yeah, there you go. Okay, I think they charge more by how many names there are in the front of the building. Okay, where he did, in addition to his regular work, a lot of pro bono work, was very active in the civil rights movement with civil rights workers in Louisiana during 1964 in the Freedom Summer. And I understand there might be a book about that coming out.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, and he'll mention that. He's helped to establish homeless shelters in New York, represented families of victims in 9/11, has been a leader in Jewish organizations, and we have some connections here tonight. He's also a husband. This is Judy, his wife. He's also a father and a grandfather. So that's a little bit about who this man is. And so we're going to find out about his book and all the neat and wonderful, interesting things he has to tell us. Welcome to Fairfield County, Jay Greenfield.
Thank you, Elisa, for that very gracious and somewhat exaggerated introduction. I want to thank the Darien Library for setting this up so nicely, the Jewish Historical Center of Lower Fairfield County, my wife told me to remember, for co-sponsoring this event. I'm reluctant to name any individual names because there's a danger of leaving people out who shouldn't be left out. But I do feel particularly grateful to Mallory Arons, who I think is not here, who helped to set this up, and to my cousins, David, Lorraine, Edward, and Helen Questim, for supporting this so enthusiastically. I say cousins, although technically they're my cousins-in-law. But after 59 years of connection to the Questim family, I think I can stop being technical. I'll say without reservation that marrying the first Questim in my life, Judy, was the best thing I've ever done. And I very appreciative to her for giving me such a good life. Now, how do I move from my own wonderful good fortune to the Holocaust, which is the worst possible misfortune for so many people, and is the background of Max's Diamonds? It hangs over the novel in a cloudy way, just as it does on the front cover of the book, where there very vaguely is a sign over Auschwitz, Arbeit macht frei. And how do I move from one to the other? I move resolutely, because we who are so blessed living in America at this time must not forget what human beings are capable of. And we must not forget, not simply because our people, the Jewish people, were the victims of this, but because if we don't forget, if this becomes just a footnote in history or a question on an exam, then the chances of it recovering in our lifetime is all too great. The last reading that I gave in Middletown, Connecticut, was that the last one? Yes, was by coincidence on September 11. And it made me address the question of whether there are similarities, parallels, between the Holocaust and what happened on 9/11. I concluded that there are parallels, that they're important, that they're frightening. In each one, mass murderers with an overarching worldview were determined, well-organized, and fanatic enough to try to wipe out large groups, as many members of these groups as they could, without any kind of process, let alone due process, and without any consideration of the victim's merits or shortcomings. In the case of the Holocaust, if you had a single grandparent who was Jewish, that, generally speaking, was enough to mark you as a victim. In the case of Al-Qaeda, if you were in a certain place at a certain time, you were to die, irrespective of why you were there. To the murderers, it was totally impersonal. But to the victims, the stripped-naked grandmother from Minsk who was urged to go in the shower, the secretary from Cantor and Fitzgerald in the World Towers who was awaiting a death either by burning or by being crushed, it couldn't have been more personal. To me, and I hope I'm wrong, these similarities mean that it can happen again. Particularly as I said before, we lose sight of the fact that when there's ever any mass extinction of people, it's an impersonal thing, we lose sight of their humanity, and they become the other, which is a very dangerous thing to be. But the victims of 9/11, the victims of the Holocaust, the victims of my lie, I mean, this is, some people kill more than others, but there are many cases of impersonal killing. They're people with unique characteristics who, by and large, have done nothing to deserve mistreatment, let alone extinction. At another reading on Cape Cod, that was about 3 weeks ago, When I was done, a 96-year-old woman who had been a survivor took the podium and spoke about her experiences in the camps and her feelings about the importance of preserving the memory. And she was followed by a 93-year-old man who was born in Germany, who managed to get to the United States when he was a boy, who was in the United States Army, landed on D-Day, was an interpreter at the Nuremberg trial, and he asked me how, after all that had happened, I could believe in a beneficent God. Well, my answer was, I don't. What happens on this earth, I think, is up to us. But this question has to be pondered by any person who's concerned with things beyond their immediate surroundings and themselves. So please, if I talk about anything that has a personal impact to you, or that raises a question, or if you have personal experiences you want to share, please speak up when the reading is over. My story is made up. The real world is more important to learn about. Now let me go to the novel. I truly believe that all that counts in a novel is the words on paper. And what the writer intended or didn't intend is almost inconsequential. It's what comes across to the reader that counts. But for me, there are two principal themes to Max's Diamonds. The first is the impact that the Holocaust has had upon people who were not its direct victims. In Max's Diamonds, the central character actually benefited from it financially. And the second theme, which I didn't intend, but it came out, the consequences of being a successful Jew in America and being invited or allowed to participate in the WASP aristocracy. That's a complicated thing. It's not a mixed blessing, it's not an all blessing, it's not an all curse. It's a very complicated thing, which during this period when Jews are probably better off in America, I'll take out the probably, are better off in America than they've ever been in their history. Now to the novel. The novel begins in 1947, but it's had its genesis in 1939, when I was 6, almost 7 years old. On the first day of September, Hitler invaded Poland, and the killing of Jews began in earnest. 2 years later, I began to attend an Orthodox Hebrew school. I had classes 4 afternoons a week, classes Sunday morning. I went to children's services every Saturday morning. I went for 5 years, past my bar mitzvah, which was very out of the ordinary then and still is now. And a miracle occurred. And that miracle was that despite all my attendance, I learned almost absolutely nothing. The school was simply terrible. And I hope they've gotten better, but I'm suspicious. And most of what I learned didn't stick. But one lesson was drilled into us over and over and over, and it did stick. And it may still stick today. And that's since before recorded history, various enemies have tried to destroy the Jewish people. They didn't succeed, and they often disappeared. There's a corollary to this lesson, us and them. And I may have learned that too well. My own experiences and successes as a Jew in America after the 1940s made it clear that this lesson, us and them, didn't describe the America I was actually living in. But in the early 1940s, I was an impressionable little boy. The Nazis were riding high, and they were making no bones about their intention. In 1945, when I was 12 years old and preparing for my bar mitzvah, the camps were liberated. And the full dimensions of the Shoah horror, including the numbering on the arms, hit me hard. the numbers hit me particularly hard. Because to the Nazis, we weren't humans with names. We were numbers on the road to extinction. I lived, and there's a lot in the book about this, in a summer town called Auburn in Rockaway, New York. The population during the winter, and the winter was every month that wasn't the summer. The population during the winter was about 5,000 people, about 70% Jewish. In the summer, it was about 15,000 people, and about 90% Jewish. And this included people who had survived the camps and did have the numbers on their arms. This wasn't a Picture in Life magazine or an archaeopathic newsreel. These were real people. And I was simply intrigued is the wrong word, obsessed is the wrong word, I guess overwhelmed by them. I had questions that I was afraid to ask and even more afraid to have answered. What had they experienced? How did it affect them? And the question I was ashamed even to raise in my head, had they done things to survive that compromised their own humanity? I was afraid of my questions and tried to keep a physical distance from them. But toward the end of the summer, when I was almost 15, a man with numbers came right up to me. I was working in Karp's Dairy, a kosher grocery store 1 block away from the boardwalk and the beach. And Karp sold kasher, which we now would call groats or buckwheat, but the only appropriate name is kasher. It's used to make kasher knishes or kasher vanishkes, and I don't want to say the word too much because I'll get heartburn. We sold it by the pound from 100-pound sacks. And every few days I'd pull a little red wagon to a large deli on the boardwalk, put a sack in the wagon, and lug it back to Karp's. I wanted to pick it up in front of the deli on the boardwalk. I liked the gig. I liked the Atlantic Ocean. I liked to swallow salt air. The Atlantic plays a very important part of the novel. But most of all, I wanted to show off. At that time, hard as it is for me to accept, I was a skinny little kid. And I wanted the world to see that I could lift a 100-pound bag of kasher. I waited for it on the boardwalk, and a deli man who I'd never seen before carried a sack like it was a pillowcase full of feathers. I saw the numbers on his arm. He grew closer, and I was about to be confronted for the first time. Despite the population of survivors in the town where I lived, I was about to be confronted by a survivor, and my brain froze. He said something, but I have no idea what. He realized that I was staring at his numbers. I realized it too when I saw him scowl, and without another word between us, he dropped the sack in the wagon, and I lugged it back to Karp's. From then on, I didn't pick up bags in front of the deli on the boardwalk. I picked them up from the kitchen in the back, out of sight of the boardwalk, where I couldn't meet the deli man again. Now, more than a half-century later, when I sat down to write Max's Diamonds, I didn't know what the story would be, but I knew a few things about the novel. I knew I would start with the numbers. And I knew that the central character, who I call Paul Hartman, would be someone who didn't suffer physically or directly from the Shoah. He wasn't a survivor or a child of survivors. In fact, he benefited from the Holocaust financially through a fortune in diamonds that a distant cousin, Max, an Auschwitz survivor himself, mysteriously smuggled into America. He was obsessed with the Holocaust because it in fact paid for his tuition, and when it looked like he was going to break up with his girlfriend, or more likely she was going to break up with him, it paid for the diamond in the ring he gave her to cement their engagement. There's one other thing I was very aware of as I wrote it, and that's that information about the Holocaust, both in the novel and in the real world, has to come from unreliable narratives. I got this idea from Maus, M-A-U-S, Mice in German, a Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel by Art Seligman. And in this novel, Seligman's father, the novel is, well, it looks like a comic strip, it's monumentally unfunny, but the father tells him the story of his experiences at Auschwitz, and several of the things that he says are flat out wrong. And he doesn't remember things that very clearly were happening in the camp. I mean, for example, there was a prisoners' orchestra, which you know, only the Nazis could think of that. But there was a prison, and it was a pretty good orchestra. But that is that the direct testimony about what happened, even if it's from someone like Elie Wiesel, has got to be suspect. You were not sitting there recording a history and taking detailed notes about what was happening that day. You were trying to get through one more day, and that was no small amount. So I'm going to start with the numbers at the very beginning of chapter 1, where we meet the central character. Chapter 1. Paul's mother told him not to look at the numbers on Cousin Max's arm. Make believe they're not there, she said, the night Max moved in with them. But when Paul awoke the next morning, the last day of 1947, he saw nothing else. 53927 glowing on a pale arm across the room. He rolled over toward the wall and pulled the blanket over his head. You can look. Numbers don't bite, escaped a scratchy voice from the other bed. Max's English was a surprise. From the moment Max arrived last night, Paul had heard only Yiddish from his cousin and the dozen relatives and friends who had gathered to meet him. Paul understood very little, aside from the sobs and the names of dead people in concentration camps. He wiggled his head out of the blanket. I'm sorry, he said to the wall. Sorry for what? You didn't do nothing. I didn't mean to stare at them. Staring is not so terrible. Everyone got a number, unless you weren't direct. Paul turned back to face his cousin. He couldn't hide, he shouldn't. I'll try not to stay too long, Max continued. Paul sprang up. No, stay. I don't mind. I won't ask anything. Max lay still. Only his arm, neck, and head showed. Except for the purple numbers on his straight stick of forearm, his skin was a faded gray of the blanket. His neck had grooves and ridges where tendons jutted from the skin. His cheeks and eyes seemed sucked into his skull. Max is 40, Paul's mother had told him. Daddy's age if he was alive, but he looks 80. To Paul, he looked older than the oldest stone in Mount Hebron Cemetery, across from the 1939 World's Fair, where for him, Daddy breathed under the ground. Now, Max and Paul shared a room, but they avoided each other. In the morning, Paul would normally awake early, and he would face the wall and fake sleep, until he heard Max leave the apartment. But on the second Monday in March, he didn't hear Max leave the room. The only sound was the radio from the Rossini's first floor apartment. Dinah Shore singing Buttons and Bows. Had he fallen back asleep and missed Max's departure? Would he have time to check his math homework again? He rolled over. Max was sitting on his bed across the room, dressed and staring at him. His eyes seemed even deeper and blacker than usual. His cheeks more hollow. I got to ask you something. Paul looked at the clock by Max's bed, but it was turned away from him. He might be late for band rehearsal. What? Paul sat up and kept the blanket wrapped around him. You know when you played the clarinet last night? Paul pulled the blanket tighter and nodded. You know what you were playing? It's for the band, the spring concert. The name of it? Tan. Paul stopped in the middle of the word, afraid his voice would crack. Tannhäuser. Max said with disgust. When we stood outside to be counted, they played it on the loudspeaker. Appel, they called it. Morning roll call, even though it was black outside. Hours in the freezing cold. People would go in their pants. If you moved, they shot you. If you were lucky, they shot. Otherwise, the dogs. You know who wrote it? Wagner, Paul whispered. The worst kind of Jew hater. Hitler's favorite composer. I won't play it, Paul said. Silently, he added, at home. If he didn't play it in school, they'd kick him out of the band, and it wouldn't be on his college applications. A Nazi before Nazis got invented. I won't play it. Max shook his head. I can't ask that. I'm only here because your mother's so nice. I don't want to make trouble. She wants you should go to a big college. That evening, Paul waited for Max in the room they shared. Max was surprised to see him, standing between the iron beds, but neither of them spoke. Paul waited while Max put his coat, hat, and jacket in the closet. He knew Max wouldn't remove his tie or roll up his shirt sleeves. I've decided, Paul began, and suddenly he saw nothing but the gray rectangle beside Max's bed where his parents' wedding picture had been. Let me step back a little to something that I skipped. The room that they're in had been the room of Paul's parents, who were immigrants from Czechoslovakia, as was Paul, although he was only an infant when they came over. And there were pictures on the wall, photographs of various things from Czechoslovakia. But on the day that Max came in, Paul's mother took down all the pictures. They would be upsetting to Max. But if pictures hang on a wall for any substantial amount of time and you take them down, they will leave a shadow on the wall outlining the precise size and shape. He saw nothing but the gray rectangle beside Max's bed, where his parents' picture had been. 36 people, the bride in white, the rest wearing black, all standing straight and looking earnest. He heard nothing except his father's voice just before they went to the beach on the day he died. Your mother, the prettiest bride anyone could remember, blonde like a goy. Our parents, 3 grandparents who wouldn't leave no matter how we pleaded or what Hitler threatened. He had named each sister, brother, aunt, and uncle. Over 100 people came, but the photographer couldn't get them all in the picture. So there's no cousins or friends. But my mother, this is Paul's father speaking, your grandma Giddle counted, and we put back one of the cousins to get the number to 36. That's twice high, which in Jewish is a number 18 and means life. A lucky number. Was Max the cousin they had added? Was he in one of the other rectangles, the one of his father's swim team at the Hebrew Youth Games? Was everybody in that picture dead? What's wrong? Max knit his sparse eyebrows. Sit on your bed, maybe lay down. I'll get you some water. I'll get it, Paul said, but he couldn't move from the wedding picture that was no longer there. Everything went blank until he drank the water Max had brought. Why'd they want to kill all the Jews? Paul's question surprised him. Good question, younger man, but they never gave me an explanation. For a moment, Max's lips widened, as close to a smile as Paul had seen on his face. I'm not going to play Tannhäuser. Don't be ridiculous. Max's mouth twisted in contempt. The Goyim run the world, and you do what you got to. You beat them at their own game. Max then disappeared for several days, and Paul's mother wouldn't tell Paul where he had been or why he was gone. Paul protested he wanted to know, but really, he felt he was better off not knowing. On Sunday evening, after Max had been gone for 5 nights, Paul heard him climb the inside stairs. Fortunately, he was in the small room, and the clarinet was assembled, he began to play Sousa, loud enough to drown out any discussion between the adults. But after a few bars, Max tapped at the bedroom door. Max stood in the doorway, still wearing his oversized hat and coat, carrying a black case. "This'll help you." He thrust out the case. "I bought it for you where I went. Take it." Paul obeyed, but held the case at arm's length. "You can open it. It's not poison." Max left and closed the door behind him. Paul's fingers fumbled with the latch, but it finally opened. It was a clarinet. How would he not recognize the case? But it was more than a clarinet. It was a new Buffett, the best make in the world. The pathetic Bundy that Paul had just been playing, made of metal and purchased for $5 at the synagogue rummage sale, didn't belong in the same room with it. The Buffett's tube was the blackest black he had ever seen. The keys shone like silver. Maybe they were silver. This was no instrument for a poor boy from Auvergne, an immigrant from Czechoslovakia, to play in the second chair of a public high school band. He left the clarinet in the case and went to the kitchen. Max, still wearing his hat and coat, with a suitcase at his side, was sitting at the yellow metal table across from his mother, telling her something in Yiddish. His father had sat in that same chair with her, but he had never worn such a ridiculous hat and coat, in or out of the house. And his father usually insisted on speaking English, although Yiddish sometimes slipped in. Paul looked at Max and said, "Thanks, Max turned away. "Why thanks?" his mother asked. She stood up and began folding napkins. "He bought me a new clarinet, the best there is." His mother, shocked, dropped the napkins in her hand. She leaned over toward Max and away from Paul. "Favus?" she both asked and scolded. "Why?" Max answered her in Yiddish, and they continued in that language as if they were alone. I'm going to jump about 4 pages. During those pages, Paul learns that Max had been a good violinist, and he asked Max to help him audition for the high school orchestra. "Will you help me?" Paul blurted out. Max's hands dropped from Paul's shoulders. "You don't have to help. I shouldn't have." Max wasn't listening. His cheek seemed to have disappeared into his skull. His cousin, who had survived the unimaginable, looked as if he would decompose in front of him. "Help you play music?" Max asked himself softly, and then even more softly, "like I used to help Reuben." Paul didn't understand. Reuben, his father, hadn't played any instrument. I'll go back a little bit. Reuben was a very common name in their family, and every generation there were at least 1 or 2 people named Reuben. Suddenly Max stood tall and pulled his round shoulders back. "Yes, I'll get a violin and we can play together." "Would you really?" "And I'll give you a key for a box." Paul didn't understand. "Only me and my partner know about it. I want you to have my share in case for yourself, nobody else. I'll explain tomorrow when we're not so tired." And the next day, Max brought home a violin case. But before Paul could see what was in it, Max left the apartment. Sometimes later, Paul learned from the police that Max had jumped off a jetty into the ocean and had drowned. He jumped off on what was 64th Street in Rockaway. This becomes significant shortly. The adults in the house, Paul's mother and her parents, were conscious of having spent most of their lives in Europe, and they were afraid of the police, no matter what the circumstances. At one point, Paul's grandmother says, "The main purpose of the police every place, including Israel, is to give the Jews a hard time." And there was reason to believe that. They decided to ask Bernie to come over. Bernie is a major character who Paul loathed and feared. the incarnation of corruption, the opposite of Paul's idealized image of his father. Later in the novel, Bernie describes himself as follows: "I'm not part of the mob. I'm just a reliable Jew boy they do business with because I'm too smart to cheat them. They respect me." Bernie took charge. Paul left the adults in the kitchen, saw Max's violin case on Max's bed, and opened it. The case opened easily. The violin glowed, but what glowed even more was a white envelope tucked under the handle. It was for him, for Max. Bernie would seize it in seconds. Paul stuffed the envelope in his pocket and returned to the small bedroom without looking into the still silent kitchen. He held the envelope up to the desk light and made out a key and a piece of paper inside of it. But Bernie was only a few feet away. Paul rolled the envelope up along its length and with the clarinet cleaning brush pushed it up the buffer tube as far as it would go. Max would be pleased with his cunning. Paul went into the small room, which is now his mother's, which had been his, lay down on the bed, and put a pillow over his head. At some time, he wasn't keeping track of time, his mother removed the pillow. The red-eyed woman above him could never have once been the prettiest blonde-like-a-goy bride anyone had ever seen. She was a plain Jewish housewife, as drab as those who shopped in their grocery. No makeup, nondescript brown hair, a shapeless gray dress, the same one she wore behind the grocery counter, and a blue apron. "I don't know what you heard. We tried to talk low, but Bernie gets excited." Paul didn't stir. "Forget poor Max drowned. We're going to tell everybody it was a heart attack." Like, she took a few deep breaths and began to cry. "Like Daddy." "Okay. There would be trouble if somebody finds out, so don't tell anybody. Bernie spoke to Captain Kiley, and the cops will go along." "Okay. Dead is dead. No difference how. Do you want to stay home from school tomorrow?" "No." "That's better, so there won't be more questions. But if somebody asks you what happened to Cousin Max, like when they asked about..." "Heart attack," Paul said, but he knew nobody would ask. He had never mentioned Max to anyone. The next major scene is a funeral, which was at an open grave, and oddly enough, there were 18 people there. 6 of them had been in the apartment the night before, and the other 12 were told the heart attack story, the other 12 including the rabbi. Paul found this very upsetting, but what is he going to do? Set things up so his mother gets arrested? So he went along. But on the way home in the car, he decided to throw away the key. He tends to analyze and overanalyze everything, but here his entire analysis was, it stank. Dad would want him to get rid of it. The only question is, does he throw it away at 64th Street, where Max jumped, or on 70th Street, where he had where he spent his last day with his father, and where his father was teaching him how to swim? He dropped it on 70th Street. On the following weekend, at his mother's urging, Paul went with his Boy Scout troop on a 2-night camping trip to Camp Alpine in New Jersey. When he returned, most signs of Max were gone. Clothing, toilet kit, glass statuettes. Let me again mention something I skipped. Max, at some point, started buying very inappropriate gifts for the family. He bought, the first one after the buffet was a brand new post-war GE Frigidaire. And it just looked ridiculous in their small and squalid kitchen. He then bought a Philco, not television yet, although television was coming out. He bought a Philco console. It looked equally ridiculous and took up most of the living room. He bought Venetian glass statuettes, all kinds of things that in Paul's mind underscored his own father's lack of money, and Paul almost saw them as mocking his father. Most signs of Max were gone: clothing, toilet kit, glass statuettes, silver tea service, alarm clock. In addition, the big bedroom had been painted, erasing the reverse shadows of the photographs from Czechoslovakia. Still, Paul felt his cousin's presence. His musty smell seemed to pervade the apartment. The next morning, in fact, he smells it even in the basement, where there was no reason to believe that Max had ever been. The next morning, he and his mother are at the table sorting laundry that Paul is going to bring to the laundromat. "I don't understand," Paul said to his mother while they were sitting at the kitchen table. "You get rid of Max's gifts, except for the two biggest, the Philco and the GE Frigidaire. Who needs reminders of such sadness," she said to him. "But Bernie thinks if they go too soon, it'll look funny, like we're taking down monuments Max put up to himself." She dropped her voice and lowered her eyes to the laundry. "Maybe if we locate what Max wanted us to have, we'll move and can find an excuse to get rid of them too." Desperate to change the subject, Paul started to describe some of the birds he had seen in Alpine, but his mother interrupted. "Max said he was going to give you a key and a note explaining how we could find something. Did he give them to you?" Paul felt waves from the Atlantic cresting before him. He resisted the urge to swallow and said no, as casually as he could. "We looked everywhere, even in the clothing we were boxing for the Hebrew Aid Society, even in his underwear, but couldn't find nothing." Paul was holding two of his grandfather's soiled boxer shorts. Why couldn't that grumpy bastard take care of his own shit? "Paulie, don't call me that." He was being disrespectful, but she deserved it. "Are you sure he didn't give you anything? I mean, beside the fancy clarinet?" Paul stood up, raised the underpants above his head, and flung them down at the table. "If you think I'm lying, just say so." No, I know you wouldn't lie to me." Her voice was too soft, almost obsequious. "You're like Daddy that way." She reached out for Paul's hand, but he moved it away from the table. Years later, when Paul starts to tell certain people the whole story, they absolutely don't believe that he threw the key in the ocean. Now, from that point on, the diamonds, the key in the ocean, the numbers, the lies about Max dominate Paul's life. He lives the American dream, having great commercial and success as a lawyer. But it's often a nightmare. It's not until 1980, 30 plus years after he first saw 53927, when Paul is confronted by an Israeli 20-year-old violinist who has changed her name to Ruby Hartman, obviously after Reuben, and Hartman is Paul's name, and who claims to be his daughter, that Paul first sees that there is hope of coming to peace with those numbers and their aftermath. That's what I'm going to read, but I'd be glad to answer any questions about the novel, glad to hear about your own experiences, and glad to answer any questions about, how I developed my second career very, very much in the latter part of my life. Thank you.